Welcome everyone to the September edition of the Ask Evoke Q&A so Kylie and I try to do this every month and we collect questions from our audience and give as succinct and as individualized answers as we can, although in some cases it can be difficult to get too close to too individual with people because we don't know enough about their history. But along those lines, Kylie, today I'd like to mention at least a couple of instances recently where we have helped people on an individual basis who have either reached out to us for a phone consultation or in your case, it was writing a custom plan for this one person after doing a phone consult with him. And why don't I start first with the one that I got a very nice email from this gentleman who lives in Chamonix, and he and I had done a couple of phone consultations in his build up to his A race this year, which just happened a week or two ago. And here's what he said in his email. I just wanted to touch base with you to say thanks and give you a little update. You may remember I was training for the Tour de Géant, which took place last week. I finished the event and in much better time than expected. As we discussed during training, I'm a mid-packer. I've never done a 100-mile race, let alone a 200-mile race. My longest run previously was a DNF at the TDS last year, which is 110 kilometers. I finished the Tour de Géant in 75th position in 110 hours. But that's not even the good part. The mind-blowing part was that I actually raced well within myself. I kept checking myself to go slowly, and I waited for my legs to get tired or lack energy and power, and they just never did. Sleep and tiredness was, of course, an issue, but physically, the effort, how well I felt after the effort and how I feel now, leaves me feeling like I probably could have pushed harder, if anything. I know that you know this already, but I credit this almost entirely to the ME workouts I did and the structure we put together. You may remember my running volume was quite limited for the size of the event. I had 4 weeks total that were over 110 kilometers, but the average week was only 70 to 80 kilometers since April or May. So something worked, and it probably wasn't the volume of running. So that was congratulations, first of all, to this person. It's a wonderful result, especially for somebody who's never dipped their toe into a race of that length and of that difficulty. That I've coached a few folks, and I know you have, Kylie, that have competed in the Tour de Géant. It's no joke. It's a pretty serious race with a heck of a lot of elevation. I've forgotten the numbers, but it's a crazy amount in about, I think it's 350 kilometers. So anyway, hats off to him. But I just wanted to put this out there that this is the kind of stuff that we do every day. And so if you're looking for very personalized, we'll try to give answers here today as best we can. But if you really need to get down in the weeds, then reach out to us one way or the other. We'll try to help you. And Kylie, I know you had a remarkable story with a fellow who reached out who was struggling because he's a very fast twitch athlete, and he was wondering, he had read the article on the website about training fast versus slow twitch and had a lot of questions about it. But give us a little more insight. You got a very excited text message from him recently.
Yeah, well, I can't take full credit for this one because we did it together. But yeah, we had an athlete reach out who was more fast twitch, meaning like 5K runner, 10K, and he was following some prescribed running programs. Like if you Google how to train for a 5K, how to train for a 10K, it often talks a lot about tempo workouts and quite a bit of what would fall into most people's zone 3 training. And he was just not having success. He wasn't getting awful, but he just wasn't seeing improvement. And in fact, he was often really, really tired with this work. And so he reached out to us and we just had a 1-hour phone consult with him. If you remember Scott, he's from Spain. And just talking about, he was specifically very fast twitch in college and his childhood, 200 meter kind of runner, 800 max maybe. And so, yeah, just realizing that when you're really fast twitch, that tempo work or that zone 3, often the training load or the fatigue that it creates isn't worth the benefit, or it actually can have negative benefits for that type of athlete. And so we reworked a custom plan for him, and he texted me and said he had his first win of the year running a 15-minute and 2-second 5K. So that's pretty fast. He's nearing 40. I think he's an older athlete. So that's remarkable. And he's just over the moon. So I think this athlete to me reinforced that every individual is really specific, and you can read training books or plans. But if you have a very niche physiology, like he's super fast twitch, it's worth reaching out to a coach to get like fine tuning, I guess, to that, to get that next level. And like you said, we're happy to do that at Evoke, and keep sending us your success stories. As Scott says, we do this every day, but we love hearing from you. So DM or email is great.
Yeah, well, thanks and congratulations to you, Kylee. It's not easy coaching fast twitch athletes, and even just writing a training plan for them can be a challenge. I've only had to do it a few times, and it's fun to work with them because they tend to be fast already. You just need to help them build endurance, but it takes a completely different approach than it does with a typical slow twitch athlete that is who 90% of the people we deal with are like that, because most people that are fast twitch are not attracted to multi-hour events. It just doesn't suit their physiology. But anyway, congratulations to him as well. It does sound like it was a fun, exciting race, and that's quite a good time. So he should be pleased with that.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like I think you mentioned, the fast twitch are like lions. They need a lot more rest, often more prone to injury. It is a lot harder.
They can't handle a high volume. Well, there's a lot of things that are different about working with slow and fast twitch. And, there's an article on the website that kind of gives a high elevation view of how we treat them differently. But one of the big things that they can't do is a high volume of sustained faster running, which is exactly what a slow twitch runner will thrive on. And so that's where I think most of the mistake, and that's what had happened with this fellow. All his friends are slow twitch runners, and they were saying, well, you need to train like us. And he kept, he was getting worse, or not, like you said, stagnating. So,
yeah. No, it's interesting.
Why don't we dive in? We got some great questions this week, although the first one I have to say is going to stump me. I will reach out to Killian and see if I can get an answer to this, but why don't you start off with that one?
Sure. So our first question here is, while watching Killian's insanely impressive Alpine Connections project, I noticed he was wearing what looks like a loop recorder heart rate monitor under his shirt attached to his chest. Just curious if you're aware of what device that is, or what training data he might be collecting. Maybe something us mortals could incorporate into our training. Thanks for doing the Q&A. Always look forward to it. Yeah, just as a sidebar, that was a phenomenal record Killian set. Wow.
Yeah.
Just
he's a pretty phenomenal guy.
Yeah.
But yeah. Well, in all candidness, I don't know what he was collecting, but I will text with him and ask him what kind of data he was collecting on that. I did speak with him earlier in midsummer, I think, and he told me he was embarking on a project to experiment with very calorie restriction and training at a high level to kind of see what he could get away with, in terms of how much work could he do and not have the quality be affected too much while doing calorie restriction. And in the process, they were going to be doing all kinds of testing with him in terms of collecting all the kind of metrics they could. And I know he's big on that. 2 years ago or 3 years ago now, three UTMBs ago, he was being tested at several of the aid stations, and they were testing blood glucose levels, lactate levels, um, I think also his electrolyte levels. And so he's really into the data side of things, and he's a very analytical guy. So it wouldn't surprise me if he was trying to collect a bunch of information here. But
Mm-hmm.
like I said, I don't have any insight, but I'll reach out to him and see if we can figure that out. And if I get an answer and and if he is willing to divulge it, that is, and he's usually quite open, so I don't think that'll be a problem. But we could discuss that on our next get together in October.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wonder or speculate if it has something to do with Koros, because that's one of his, he works so closely with them with the development of their technology. So who
Yeah.
knows? And then I was wondering with the calorie restriction thing, his record he just did, he was above 3,000 meters a lot, like the 4,000 meter peaks. I wonder you're more prone to stomach upset and you're less hungry at altitude. So wondering if he's trying to figure out uh more what he can get away with because it's really hard to eat at that as you go
Yes.
higher
Yeah.
as well. So yeah, it's
Well, and I
interesting.
mean, we see that in ultra running races a lot. People that have done this, done those, have often experienced gastrointestinal disorders and disruptions, and often it's the causes them to drop out of races. But I'm curious to find out what he was looking
Mm-hmm.
for. In fact, I looked back at that text just now while we were talking, and he did say, "When I'm done with this, I'll share the information with you." So I think I can get some info out of him.
Okay.
If anybody's fat adapted out there, it's got to be him.
Yeah, that's true. So,
It's
yeah.
funny. I have to tell a very brief story about meeting Killian. The first time I met him, we had agreed to write that Training for the Uphill Athlete book together, and he just happened to be coming from. He was living at that time. He was living in Chamonix, and he was about to fly to Anchorage, Alaska, to take part in the mountain marathon.
Mm.
And so I flew up to Anchorage, and so we could actually have a sit down and talk. And in that first conversation, so the way the thing started, I walked into the hotel, the dining room first thing in the morning, and there was Killian sitting there with this enormous pile of all the sugariest, sweetest jelly rolls and donuts and that sort of thing on this huge plate. And he was, I don't think this was before he, I think, paid a lot of attention to his diet. And I think he just ate anything and everything he could to get enough calories in. But while sitting there and chatting, he told me what he'd done that week.
Mm.
And I have to recount this because I think I've mentioned it, but many years ago in some other podcast for people that haven't heard this. So just as some indication of this guy's phenomenal work capacity, that week he had first he had gone with a friend, and they had um, climbed the Colton McIntyre route on the north face of the Grand Shiraz from
Mm.
the valley floor. And this is 1,000 meter, I think it's 510 M4 route. Descended the other side into Courmayeur, and then hiked back around
Mm.
that day. He did that with I can't remember the exact numbers, but it was like a half a liter of water and 3 or 4 goo packages. Then 2 days later, he paced a friend in a 50K. And 2 days after that, he won the vertical kilometer competition in Chamonix. Then
Wow.
he flew to Anchorage and the next day won the mountain marathon.
Oh
This is
my.
all in one week. And
It's remarkable.
it is really staggering what that guy has been able to
Mm-hmm.
accomplish. And and he wasn't bragging. He was just like saying, "Well, this is my
Mm-hmm.
week. This is what my week has
Mm-hmm.
looked like so far." Um, so
Yeah.
yeah, he's on a different level. And that's why when, I've said this before also, and I tried to get the point across in the book when he and I were working on that book together. He said one thing we have to be careful of is people need to understand they shouldn't try to do what I do.
Right.
That's
Yeah.
the quickest road to disaster, is to try to copy someone who's, not only got 35 years of this kind of training under his belt, but also obviously some sort of genetic anomaly here. So,
Yeah, you know what I find it really impressive too, just on his note, is his longevity. I mean, he is getting older now too.
yeah,
And I often think, oh yeah, he's doing these big mountain records, which makes sense. As you age, your endurance can still be quite good. But then he won, was it Sierra Zinzal this year?
Sierra Zinal,
So
yes, yeah,
no,
yeah,
yeah, like
yeah,
he's still so good at the
yeah,
sharp end as well, which is
yeah,
a phenom by very very much so. Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, it'll be neat to follow his trajectory as he keeps going as well. Mhm.
It's
Yeah,
pretty
and
exciting.
I just saw they're expecting another baby, so that's exciting too.
Oh, I hadn't heard
Yeah,
that. That's
yeah,
great.
it was on
Yeah.
social media, so I'm not.
Okay. Yeah, that's I
Yeah.
don't do social media, so
Mhm.
I will, but that'll give me a good excuse to reach out and
Yeah,
congratulate him and
yeah,
ask this
pretty cool.
question about what the heck what kind of data they were collecting in
Yeah,
that
yeah,
effort.
exciting.
Um,
All right, let's move on to our next question here, Scott. We have a question from Nick, and he says, you guys have talked about being efficient in your running, walking stride as important for being faster and preventing injury. Do you have any running and rucking efficiency drills or workouts that can help improve a person's economy of motion?
That's a great question, and for running, I would say we definitely do. So there's a couple of ways to think of economy. One is um, you can think of it from a mechanical standpoint. It's the amount of energy it takes you to move at a certain speed. And that's what we might consider technique. And you can think of, I'm sure those of you that are not good swimmers can understand that swimming is a very technically reliant sport. You can take someone who's extremely fit and throw them in the pool, and they'll make a lot of foam and splash, and they don't move very far or very fast because they don't have the technique, regardless of their fitness. But then the other kind of economy is metabolic economy, the way your body is producing the energy. But I'm going to leave that aside for the moment, and we'll talk about the kind of the technical economy. So for running, especially, the main way we can increase running economy is that you spend more time in the air than you do with one foot touching the ground at a time. And running is, as compared to, let's say, rucking, they're different in that running is an activity in which only one foot touches the ground at a time. Whereas in walking or, rucking, hiking, whatever you want to call it, at some point in the stride, you're going to have 2 feet on the ground at the same time.
Mhm.
So this flight phase in running is a result of the amount of propulsive force you give to the pushing leg that allows you to stay in the air. And actually, I was to tell another little story here, because I was at a coaching conference in like 2012, I believe, and I was a presenter there, and so was Alberto Salazar, the now somewhat discredited coach from the Nike project. But at
Mhm.
that time, he was coaching the uh, Mo Farah and Galen Rupp, who had just both won, I think, both won gold medals. I think Rupp won 2 gold medals and a silver. I mean, they had an incredibly successful, or Salazar as a coach had an incredibly successful Olympics in 12th in London. But he was talking about running economy, and he said they had done a time and motion study on Mo Farah running a
Mm.
5,000 meter on the track. And so he's a 13-minute 5,000 meter runner, roughly. And he was touching the ground less than 6 minutes.
Mm.
So he's on the ground, he's in the air more than half the time of the race. And so it was a substantial amount of air time, I guess would be a way to put it. And the way you get that is by increasing the power in your
Mhm.
legs.
Mhm.
So one of the quickest and easiest ways to increase this flight distance you have is to develop more powerful legs. And I don't mean just stronger legs, I mean more powerful. I mean, you can get stronger legs by lifting heavy weights in the gym, but the problem with that is that the rate of force production or muscle contraction rate is so slow. It's so different than, you have just a quarter of a second when your foot is on the ground. You need to be producing that power. So what we do for this is we do hill sprints. We recommend hill sprints. You can do other sort of plyometric activities. You could do box jumps and other things that I think would work well too. But what we found with the hill sprints is, because it is running. You're actually running uphill or bounding uphill, trying to be as explosive and powerful as you can. And the reason we do it on hills as opposed to flat ground is that most of the people, well, pretty much everybody we work with, they don't come from a sprinting background. And it's very easy to hurt yourself sprinting on flat ground. Pulled hamstrings are common even among very good sprinters. So by putting the hill, by tipping the ground upward, so to speak, you're leaning into the ground, which is the same kind of body position you might have when you're running on the flat ground in sprinting, but you're fighting against gravity. So there's an increased resistance and you won't be sprinting as fast. The muscle contractions won't be quite as, let's say, ballistic or dynamic, and you have a lot less chance of injuring yourself. But I would say that hill sprints would be a great way to increase your running economy. Now, how much of that would transfer over to rucking? I don't know. I honestly don't know. I mean, because I think, rucking being, it's a lot slower than running. I mean, if you're talking about running with a pack on, which we don't advocate, very rarely, like as the military guys that we train, we almost never have them run with a pack, except on testing days. Like they have to do some sort of a test for their sort of for a selection or something. But we do a lot of running and we do a lot of walking with a pack on. And I think that there must be some, because we've got, fellows who can then put a pack on and run fairly fast. So there must be some crossover between, the running economy and walking with a pack economy. Sorry, I don't have a better answer. Have you ever thought of that? I haven't.
Yeah, I mean, it comes to mind the foot speed is what they both are wanting with rucking, as increasing that tempo. And I think you talked about, or the military guys talked about in one of their articles, as power also being a neurological connection as well. Like you have the
Very
strength.
much.
So it made me think when you were talking too about like a dynamic track warm up, sometimes that has some of this ladder work or shuffle steps or grapevine or like this brain gym. I wonder if that is it's for warming up your muscles, obviously, like the stretching and the heat and all of that. But I think it's also for the brain connection to fire properly. So could be something people could play around with, is some a track warm up, so to speak, if they
Sure. I think that's a great idea. A lot of people struggle, the typical slow twitch athlete that we deal with, whether they're mountaineers or trail runners who've never done any real explosive type power work, they struggle with hill sprints because they can't produce enough power to even get tired.
Yes. Yeah.
Whereas if you take someone who's a good sprinter and they do, 5 or 6 repetition, 10 or 12-second repetitions, they will be destroyed by it because they produce so much power in those. And whereas I had a woman I'm worked with a long time ago who I sent her out to do hill sprints, and she said, well, I did 40 and I didn't get tired. It's not 40 repetitions. They must not have been very fast.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. I agree. And then like I think the person was asking, we do have people who do get running assessments too. Like if you think you have a very strange gait or something, we don't actually do that at Evoke, but that is a thing that people can do.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
Okay, our next question here is, does increasing aerobic threshold help with weight loss? If I have significant ADS, aerobic deficiency syndrome, and I work on long, easy efforts for a while. Will my metabolism become better, and will I lose fat more efficiently? I've been pretty serious about treating my ADS in the last 4 months, and I think I'm seeing this effect, but not sure if it is only in my head. Thank you. And this is from Ram. What's his name?
That's a great question. And let's start with the beginning is, well, will increasing my aerobic threshold help with weight loss? Yes, absolutely. But it might take a while before you really begin to see this. If you're, I'm going to use some numbers for demonstration here. We didn't get any idea from this person about what kind of speeds they're moving or whatnot. But if you're, let's say, can only walk briskly, so maybe a 13-minute mile pace, something like that, at your aerobic threshold, then that's not going to burn a lot of energy. And so you would have to put in an awful lot of volume at that kind of pace. But over time, when your aerobic threshold pace went from 13 minutes down to 9 or 10-minute pace, and you were able to actually run, then now you're going to be using a substantially, let's say it dropped, from 13 down to 10 minutes per mile. That's a 30% improvement right there. So you're going to be using 30% more energy than you were before for every hour that you're out there, because you're going that much farther. So yes, you will see this come. You can shed weight by aerobic training. There's no question about it. There's a reason, really high level runners tend to be quite lean, because they're not carrying a lot of body fat. It's because they're doing a high volume of this, relatively low intensity, moderate, aerobic type training. So yes, to answer that part of the first question, it may not cause you to lose fat more efficiently, but you'll start burning fat more efficiently. The problem with losing the kind of fat that most of us don't want to have on our body is subcutaneous fat, the kind of fat you can grab a hold of. And unfortunately, those are the kind of fat stores that have evolved evolutionarily, so that we have to be in pretty dire straits to be actually needing to access the energy in that subcutaneous fat. That's why it's so difficult for people to lose body fat like that. Because the kind of fat that's normally used, and the kind of fat that you will get better at using through this aerobic training, is that fat that is stored in the muscle, the intramuscular fat, because that's fat that's right there on site where it's needed for energy. And you'll get better and better at, you'll develop more intramuscular fat, and you'll get better at using that intramuscular fat. But it still will be a challenge, like it is for anyone, to actually lose subcutaneous fat. That's a reason there's a whole industry built around dieting and weight loss and all this. It's not easy. But this, again, if you work on improving your aerobic threshold speed, so you're producing more power at that aerobic threshold, then yes, you will definitely begin to lose some of that fat. Excuse me. And then the last question, is it only in your head? I doubt it, but here's an easy way for you to tell is you probably have a customary loop that you hike or run, or maybe you go to the gym and you're on a treadmill for an hour. Start seeing, are you going farther? Let's say it's a loop in your neighborhood that you run, and the loop takes you 40 minutes typically. And then one day you come around and you've maintained the same sort of average heart rate for that run, and you finish on your doorstep and you go, I was 4 minutes faster today than I was the last time I timed this run, 2 weeks ago. Well, the only reason you can be faster is that you've become more aerobically fit. And so that would be the time I would retest your aerobic threshold, because you've obviously seen some kind of a performance improvement. And it's, with the kind of aerobic threshold testing we recommend, that heart rate drift test, it's free. You can do it anytime you want, and, anytime you feel like you need it.
No, that's a good answer. And I think for a lot of people, when I know maybe it was in the 90s on the machines at the gym, it always said your fat burning zone was actually quite low intensity, which was good science, I guess. But
Mm-hmm.
it is for pop culture fitness. It seems counterintuitive because when people are doing hits or something, like let's say you do hit every day and you're like, why am I not losing weight? Um, if you're primarily anaerobic, you're burning carbohydrate, correct? Mostly.
You are, yeah,
Yeah.
probably, especially if you do that, typically, customarily.
Yeah.
One
Just
of the
like a
things,
common
though, that
hit. Hmm.
one thing that happens with exercise, though, is that there's a post-exercise period
Mm,
during which, your metabolism is still revved up. It's trying
totally.
to help you recover.
Hmm.
And that has been one of the selling points of high intensity training, is that jacks your metabolism way up.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so for several hours afterwards, you're going to be, burning a bunch of calories to try to, like what they call, it's not the right term, but it's used a lot, is that replace the oxygen debt that you built during this exercise.
Hmm.
Another thing that happens is when you produce a lot of blood lactate, when your lactate levels are elevated, lactate is a appetite suppressant.
Mm,
So if you, and I know Kylee, you've done a ton of hard, high intensity training in your life.
hmm.
And I know for me, after I finish a high intensity exercise or workout, a run or whatever it is, I'm not hungry at all.
Yeah.
And I'm probably
Hmm.
not going to be hungry for, some time afterwards.
Hmm.
So there is, it's a little different than what we normally preach, but there are some
Hmm.
benefits to high intensity training for sure.
Yeah, actually, Scott, I didn't realize that. That's new for me information because I often, whenever I finish racing, I'm never hungry. Like they have post-race burgers and I'm like, blah, you know? And I always just
Yeah.
thought maybe like everything is fatigued, So maybe my digestive system is not wanting to eat as well because often when you've raced, you've been eating, especially endurance. But this makes sense with lactate accumulation because even in long distance running, by the end, you will have accumulated quite a bit of lactate, correct?
You could, especially, if it's in
Mm-hmm.
the final, let's say you're picking up the pace toward the end of the race in order
Yeah.
to, beat somebody or improve your time, then yes, you very well could be.
Yeah.
But it's in long duration races, it's harder to have that lactate, have the glycogen stores available to produce much lactate at the end of the race. In fact,
Mm-hmm.
years
Mm-hmm.
ago, once I did a study, or not a study, I did a test. I mean, nothing I do is that scientific. It's not, I can't call it a study, but I was training with a bunch of cross country skiers and we were out for like a 3 hour roller ski. And I wanted to see what their blood lactates were like while they were training. First, in the beginning, it was just I want to make sure they're going easy enough to
Mm-hmm.
do a 3 hour roller ski. So I was driving along beside them, and periodically I would stop one of them and test their blood. But then near the end of that, like we were probably, 15, 20 minutes from the end, I picked a couple of them that were the strongest guys that were out there. And I told them I wanted them to go as hard as they could for several minutes.
Right.
And what was shocking to me was how low their blood lactates were at the end of
Hmm.
that. They didn't have
Interesting.
enough, they didn't have enough glycogen anymore
Right. To
to
even.
really turn on. I mean,
Hmm.
they were, yeah, I think they both could barely make 2 millimoles,
Wow.
which is kind of amazing. But that's, because they had been depleting glycogen for
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
several hours now. And this was
Yeah.
also, I have to say, it was in the middle or toward the end of a week-long heavy duty
Training
training
block.
camp.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was, well, we'd been, we were living in one place and, training 4 or 5 hours a day often. So
Hmm.
they'd completely, they were pretty exhausted. So, but
Yeah.
that's why it can be very difficult to jack the lactates high at the end of an effort, even a moderate effort. And when you
For sure.
can't produce, like if we've talked about this before, Kylee, that
Mm-hmm.
one sure sign that you're tired is you can't get your heart rate up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You feel like you're working hard, but the heart rate won't go up. It's usually because your legs are tired.
Yep.
Well, if you were on that particular day to check your blood lactate, you'd
Mm-hmm.
find that your blood lactate was also quite low.
Hmm. Yeah.
Even though your legs may feel pretty worked and hammered. I actually did a test on myself a month ago on the treadmill. One day my legs were feeling kind of worked and tired from, I'd done a muscular endurance workout the day before. And I thought, I'm going to do some intervals and I want to check my lactate.
Mm-hmm.
My blood lactates were like I said, they wouldn't even get to 2 millimoles because they were my leg muscles were so glycogen depleted. I didn't
Right.
have enough in me to do much hard work. So
Yeah,
the
no, that's
lactate can be kind of an
interesting.
interesting
Yeah,
way of looking at it.
I'm super fascinated by lactate, doing more of a sprint dominated sport now. Yeah, it has all sorts of adverse effects in your body, it seems. But yeah, no, it's an interesting topic for sure. I think we'll move on to the next question. It's Aaron, and he says, "Hey, so I've been using a few mountaineering programs, like the 26-week program through one of your coaches, and focusing a lot on zone 2 training. I spent a decent amount of time outside and don't really like going to the gym, but I have a Peloton bike at home. On days when I'm not actually hiking or not wanting to go to the gym, how could I set up my Peloton bike to mimic zone 2 mountaineering training? Is this an effective way to train?" I think we get a question about biking every month, it seems, but that's good.
Mhm.
This is a common thing that people like to dabble with. Mhm.
Yeah, and I would say that if you are unable or unwilling to do footborne activities, then certainly, and if you're trying to supplement the training volume, that a bike is a good way to do it. If you expect it to really improve your mountaineering speed or the way you move uphill, it's going to be minimally effective. I've actually worked with one, I won't mention his name, but he's quite well-known fellow. Was a professional bicycle racer. He does skimo races now, and he likes to train on his bike.
Mhm.
And he's now spent all summer training on his bicycle, and now he's trying to make a transition to skimo, and
Mhm.
he's really slow. He's really struggling. I mean, even though he's incredibly fit because he was a pro cyclist, so he knows what that fitness is like, he's not, it's taking him several weeks to just
Mhm.
transition to footborne activities because
Mhm.
it's a completely different way of recruiting those muscles, and you're not sitting down anymore. You're fighting against gravity with every step. So bear in mind that it's a different exercise modality.
Mhm.
Um, I would say that if you're limited on time, the and weather perhaps keeping you out from hiking outdoors, a stair machine or a incline treadmill is a very good alternative. And in terms of bang for the time spent, I would say that it's 2 to 3 times more beneficial than cycling is. And I'm coming at that from when I was being coached by a Norwegian fellow who was trained through the whole Norwegian coaching programs when I was cross country skiing. I was cycling a lot at that time. I lived in Boulder, Colorado. There was a lot of really good cyclists, and I trained on the bike, 4 or 5 days a week with those guys. And he said, well, yes, that's fine for you to do, but you can only count your bike time as 1/3 of running
Mhm.
time
Mhm.
or roller skiing time. And that quickly put a damper on my cycling because I thought I'm going to have to do 3 times as much training. And it kind of makes sense when you think about it that, a world-class cyclist will often be training 30 hours a week. A world-class distance runner might train 10 hours a week.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I think there's something to that.
Yeah, in the same with when we were skating, running was we could do half the amount. So if we went for an hour ride, that was a 30-minute jog. And yeah,
Yeah.
for busy people with time effective workouts, yeah, it just bearing in mind, like you said, it takes a lot more. The one workout we've dabbled with because I just enjoy cycling and you know that is not sitting on your seat.
Yeah.
If you're really in a jam and you want to get a muscular endurance effect, would be, some 5 to 8 minute intervals, not sitting on your seat at all, trying to mimic, I believe, more weight bearing. But it's still, I would agree, pales in comparison to actually weight bearing. But if that's all you've got is your Peloton bike, maybe you could dabble with that once a week or something. Just don't sit on your seat.
Yeah, I think that would be the more effective way to use a stationary bike is not, I mean, if you're going to be doing a lot of it, then yes, doing some zone 2 cycling is probably not a bad idea, but you should establish your zone 2 cycling because it's probably going to be different than your hiking or running zone 2.
Yeah.
And I think what Kylee said is using the bike for more like muscular endurance work will be much more time efficient. You do a workout like you just suggested, 4 or 5 times 8 minutes with a couple of minute recovery in between. That's, so you're talking less than an hour's worth of work, and that's going to be a very effective type of training for you. I mean, I wouldn't be doing it 3 days a week probably, but I think, once a week, something like that could be really helpful.
Yeah. Okay, so our next question here is, what are the most common errors that self-coached athletes make despite using training for the uphill athlete and training plans without individual coaching? So I guess this question is for people who've read your book, Scott. What have you seen that people self-administer incorrectly, kind of as a theme?
Pretty much everything. I know, seriously, actually. I mean, that's not very far off the truth. But so actually, when I got done with those books, my intention, and Steve's too, at the time, we thought, well, no one's really going to care that much about either one of these books, alpinism or uphill. And we're just going to write these books, tell them how to do it, and then we're going to go back to our lives because no one's going to care. But what we found out fairly quickly was that it's one thing to tell people, describe the theory and explain the programming and that sort of thing. And it's an entirely different thing to actually put all the pieces together and make it work effectively. And that's how, Uphill Athlete got started. It's how Evoke has, continued to grow, is that we can put those pieces together for people. But I also understand that, not everyone has the ability to afford one-on-one coaching. But I would say the biggest, probably there's a couple of most common mistakes. The first one is too much high intensity. Very rarely do I encounter an athlete that's overtrained and exhausted from too much low intensity. But most of the people that I have dealt with over the years, and I would count them in the dozens of athletes, even very high level ones, who come to me in an overtrained state are almost always because they have been using too much high intensity training in their overall volume. So that's one thing, is that you have to be very judicious with the amount of high intensity training and and forcing the workouts. This was, I've said this many times before, that it doesn't matter who writes the training program. It's not going to be perfect. Even if you're having one-on-one coaching, you need to make a decision on the day of a particular training session. Am I prepared to do this? Am I going to benefit from this? And if I'm not, I need to adjust the schedule. Maybe today just needs to be a recovery day or even a day off because I can still feel my legs from 2 days ago, the thing I did. And rather than being a slave to the program where it says Tuesday, I'm doing this. Well, damn it, I'm going to do that on Tuesday, regardless. That's not the way our bodies work. It may be the way your brain works. And most people that are involved in endurance sports are already somewhat compulsive type A personalities, and they don't want to not do something. It's written down in their calendar that they're supposed to do this thing on that day. Well, they're going to try to do it. But that's not an effective way to train. You have to be more in tune with actually how you feel. And I know you do this all the time, Kylee, and I certainly do. I'll write stuff down in the training, the calendar for the athlete. And the ones that I have that are very high level, like use an example of someone like Tom Evans, who I've been working with for a number of years now, where Tom will, I'll write it out the way I want it. And then I look in there in the next day and things are shuffled around.
Mm.
And I'll go, huh, what's this? But I trust him enough to see the reason he moved that workout is that he doesn't think he's going to be ready for it tomorrow. He needs another easy day or something like that. So flexibility, I mean, that's the real thing that we hope we try to bring every day to our coaching to the athletes we work with is this flexibility, last
Mm-hmm.
minute changes. People saying, "Oh, I felt a little sick today. I'm going to not do that workout." Whereas if you're just using some kind of a stock rote program, it's not going to have that sort of, you're not going to have that feedback from a coach. And so you have to be the one that is sort of removed from the everyday emotion of like, okay, I don't want to be lazy because that's what people will do. They'll think, well, I'm going to be lazy if I don't do this.
Yeah.
But we as coaches can help alleviate some of that guilt by
Mm-hmm.
saying, no, I don't want you doing that tomorrow. I think that's going to be too much. So
Mm-hmm.
those are probably the two biggest that I've seen with people that are trying to coach themselves.
Yeah, for sure. I agree with what you said that Scott entirely. Like there's so many I think you once said the higher trained athletes too, it's almost our job is to keep them from doing stupid stuff like being the permission to take a rest or just that sounding board sometimes as well
Mhm.
towards the end of workouts and um yeah, I don't know if you read these books in the States, but in Canada we had these children books called Amelia Bedelia, where she would do everything literally, like go change the towels, and she'd go get scissors and cut holes in the towels, or dress the chicken in the recipe, and she'd put a little dress on the chicken. And I don't know
Mhm.
why that book crops into my head a lot coaching. I had an athlete who I sent nutrition requirements kind of as a guideline, and then he told me he took 8 liters of water on his skimo race. And I was like, oh my God, that just negates all the weight savings of your skimo gear.
Yes.
So
Hmm.
I think all that funny story to say it's being a critical thinker still. And if you have trouble doing that or it's not common sense for you, reach out to a coach to help fine tune that for you because adapting a book it like literally like Amelia Bedelia to you can be quite problematic. So yeah, that would be
Yeah.
I entirely agree. It's quite funny sometimes what I write and then what comes out. I actually enjoy that.
Hmm.
Like
Yes.
I
Yeah.
didn't mean that at all, but uh-huh.
Yeah.
Okay, our next question here is I plan on doing the mountain training plan from September to May. Then from May to late June, doing the Camino del Santiago, basically 585-mile walk across Spain with the lightest weight possible. How would this trek either help or hurt my July mountaineering goals? And just for a background, this guy said, I once had dreams of being an Olympic swimmer, but I'm 5'3" and 172 pounds, built like a linebacker. So my dreams of being an Olympic swimmer were over in the womb. I'm very durable though. So I think he just wants us to have an image of him
Yeah.
as an athlete.
Well, I think the simple answer is it's going to be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Anytime you spend, I mean, you're spending, so from May to late June, I mean, let's say it's 6 weeks, um, and you're covering almost 600 miles. So, we're talking almost 100 miles a week of being on your feet and moving, even with, fairly light weight. That's going to be very good for your overall endurance. And, one of the things the way I would shift it is at some point, maybe not during, you can't, maybe don't do this during the hike, although it might be smart to try to have some times when you're carrying a heavier pack, because most likely when you do your mountaineering climbs in July, you're going to have a heavier pack than because you're going to have a rope and crampons, ice axe, or that sort of thing. So even if you can't do them during the Camino del Santiago, then I would say you need to have at least several heavy weighted hikes
Mm.
after that before you go on your mountaineering trip. Otherwise, I'm afraid it's going to be kind of a shock to your body to have whether maybe it's a 30-pound pack on your back, 12, 15 kilos. That's a lot.
Hmm. Yeah. Could he even maybe add like an ME once a week on the trail or something to,
If he has the energy, he
yeah,
could,
who
yes.
knows?
But the
Yeah,
kind of muscular endurance I think that would be most beneficial for him, though, is hiking with a heavy pack.
sure. Yeah,
And
that
so
makes
that
sense.
may not be, maybe some of those. Here's a thought. Why don't maybe on the days when you're feeling extra frisky and feeling recovered and good, or maybe the day there's going to be somewhat more vertical, throw a few liters of water in your pack.
Hmm. Yeah.
And so you're not having to carry too much extra gear. You just add a few kilos of water.
Yeah. Well, that sounds good. Good luck and let us know how it goes. Our next question is a bit of a nutrition question, and this person asks, is putting electrolytes in your water essential, even though you might ingest enough salt via your food, especially when you're not eating energy bars, but sandwiches, cheese, or dehydrated food? And this is in the context of mountaineering activities, not ultra running. So
Yeah.
electrolytes for mountaineering. Hmm.
I've never used them myself. And I think for me, the reason is that with mountaineering, the intensity is low, the speeds are low, so you can eat real food. You could have a ham sandwich. You could carry a piece of pizza from the night before. Or, that's I've done that many times, and a lot of the
Hmm.
people I go ski touring with, they do the same sort of thing. Bring leftovers from dinner the night before. So if you're eating, real food, then I think there's less need for adding electrolytes to your water. Now, maybe if you're a particularly heavy sweater, it would make sense that you're going to sweat out more sodium, and then you might need to replace it.
Hmm.
But I think it becomes more of a challenge with runners because they're moving faster, and there's that jarring movement that, so having a full belly and running, anybody who's ever done that knows it's not very comfortable. So
Hmm.
they don't normally get to eat, real food during most races. So
Hmm.
yeah, that would be, I think, my suggestion is that.
Hmm. Yeah, I agree with you on that one, Scott. Really temperature dependent as well, too,
Hmm.
for electrolytes. Okay, this next question is from Rob. He says, hey, Scott, as a mountain hunter who lives in Arizona, would I be better off training for muscular endurance using the Stairmaster with a weighted pack or treadmill at 30% incline? Also, with 50-pound pack, myself weighing 165 pounds, is 45 minutes to an hour one time per week enough? I also train the other 4 days per week in the gym. Yeah, and we've been getting more questions from hunters lately, and
Hmm.
we do enjoy getting them and training you. So keep reaching out too as well, I think. Hey, Scott?
Yeah, it's pretty similar. I mean, well, obviously there's a different goal at the end of the hunt versus a climb or something, but
Hmm.
in terms of the training of hunters, backcountry hunters especially, and the training of mountaineers, it's almost identical, really.
Hmm.
Um, so yes, muscular endurance training should be on your list of exercises that you do during the week, for a hunter as a hunter. And I would, if you have the opportunity, I would mix them 30% hiking versus the Stairmaster. But if you had only one of those you could do, then I would stick with the Stairmaster because the steeper the terrain, the more muscularly demanding it is. And the gradient of a Stairmaster, as I recall, I looked it up once, and this is the Stairmaster brand. I'm sure there are other machines that kind of mimic it, but I think it was 87%, no, yeah, 87% grade. So it's a very steep, 100% grade would be 45 degrees. So it's way steeper than you could hike on a tread or even an incline trainer. My incline trainer goes to 40%. And the problem with hiking up a 40% grade is it really works your calves. And it's also, if you may not have the ankle mobility to hike that steeply. So I think that the stair machine would be a good way to go. And I will use an example of this. So one of our one of our coaches, Jack Kunzel, people may follow Jack's exploits on Instagram, but he's a prodigious mountain runner and FKT guy. He set the fastest known time on skis on Mount Blanc, just broke Killian's record just about, I don't know, a few weeks ago. And Jack trains a lot on a stair machine with a pack. And he also, because he's training often for skiing, he'll have little ankle weights that he uses. So I think if you had one muscular endurance workout per week, that's about an hour, 50-pound pack on a stair machine, that will be enough. Yeah. And the other days can be, easier aerobic work. It's easy to overdo muscular endurance training, and then
Mm-hmm.
you'll stagnate and even revert and go backwards.
Yeah. Yeah, I just saw too, you answered this very similar question on our forum as well. So, and your answer was very consistent. But if people want, he's got April 2024, I think, put a
Oh,
little more
okay.
detail on there. So um, hop on there
Thank
and
you
read
for
as well.
finding that. Yeah.
Yeah. Good. Our next question is from Lee, and he says, Hi, I'm Lee, and I've started getting aerobically fit with your 24-week mountaineering training plan as a goal to do some introductory mountaineering courses in New Zealand's Southern Alps. Unfortunately, I'm a shift worker working long 12-hour shifts, which could be either day shifts or night shifts. I often find I am unable to complete the prescribed exercises when I am working, as I'm already so exhausted during the shifts. I often miss 3 to 4 days in a row of workouts. Despite the patchy adherence, I have already seen and felt some gains aerobically and am keen to continue. Is there a better way to schedule the workouts such that I can exercise more during my days off and do much less time-consuming workouts during my shifts? Now, this is a great question because
Yeah.
I coach people who can't work out 6 days a week for various reasons. So maybe you can speak to this.
We've had this kind of, I mean, I think we've answered this question in one form or another many, many times. I've had folks who work everything from, people who are working on an offshore oil rig to ships to hospital, people that work, odd hours, police where, they've got night shifts. And so, yes, it does present a big challenge. And there's a reason, professional athletes don't do that kind of thing because they need to be more consistent. But the reality of your situation is you will have to adjust. That 24-week plan, unfortunately, is, as I've said many times about our training plans, they're sort of idealized, but they're quite generic. I mean, they're kind of a one size fits all plan. And if it doesn't happen to fit your life, then I hope it's going to provide you hopefully some ideas on what you should be implementing in your training, but you're not going to be able to follow that plan or stick very close to it. What I would do exactly what you're talking about here in your question to us, Lee, is the days when you're off from work, especially maybe the couple of days before you get off from work, you can take them off completely, no training at all, so that the days you are free from your heavy shift work, you have the energy to train a fair bit.
Mm-hmm.
And then during the periods when you're working a lot and don't have much energy, don't try to force it. I think that's a huge mistake is, you come home exhausted from work and then you go flog yourself, go for a run. I think that can be very counterproductive. It's, sometimes it'll make you feel better, but often you're just digging yourself into a hole. So and it's you have to decide whether it's beneficial or not. The only way to do that is to experiment. But so I would say that on the days when maybe you need to shift to every other day of training during the periods when you're working and save it up. We had somebody who one of our coaches just did a custom plan for this person who works 30 16-hour days in a row and
Wow.
then has 2 weeks off.
Hmm.
Well, there's no way that person is training
Mm-mm.
during those 30 days. It just can't happen.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but his was quite a physical job. He was a welder and on oil rigs. So he's, moving all the time and pretty active. So the point was it's not really at that point, the training isn't going to be as beneficial as a more consistent program.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to figure out a way to fit this into your life. And if it means, shifting it around like I've just discussed, then that's what's going to have to happen, I'm afraid. But yeah, but
Yeah.
don't beat yourself to a pulp trying to follow that program as written.
Yeah, I think people like this, not to sound sales oriented per se, but they're the perfect people, and who we created often the custom plan a product for, is because the less time you have, the more effective you want to be with your time too. I just had someone reach out to me saying, I can't do your preseason plan because on that plan, I have two sort of long days on the weekends because he's a busy accountant with three kids. He cannot get to the mountains on the weekends. And so I said, what time do you have? He has 6 hours a week, and we're writing him a custom plan because he needs to be very effective. Also, you need to know your heart rate zones so that the times you are training, it's effective training, do you know? And so I think that's just my opinion, is if you have less
Oh,
time, it's even more important to customize. Mm-hmm.
for
Yeah.
sure.
All right. Next question is from Moki, and I apologize if I'm saying your name incorrectly. And he's saying, hello, I have a question about fueling during the aerobic threshold test. If the increased rate of glycogen depletion that occurs as you shift into zone 3 is what causes your pace to slow at a constant heart rate, then would you be counteracting this drift if you fuel enough to replace that glycogen loss? For example, let's say an athlete is doing the heart rate drift test and they take a gel before and then ingest 100 grams of carbs during. They could most likely sustain a zone 3 or even zone 4 heart rate for an hour without any drop in pace if they are fit. And just for reference, he's referencing a 5-zone system, not 4. Would you recommend not fueling at all during the aerobic threshold test, and also being careful with fueling too much beforehand? Also, I'm a big fan of the Vocast and have been listening since you were at Uphill Athlete, Scott. We really appreciate all the info. You've been a great inspiration to me.
I think this is a really good question because Moki, I think you're missing some important points here. First of all, it's not necessarily glycogen depletion that causes the heart rate to drift upward. It's often the core temperature is thought to be one of the culprits of that, and dehydration. So, but I don't think it's necessarily glycogen depletion. And also, I don't think I've never known a person that could sustain a zone 4 intensity for an hour. I don't care what they ate. I don't think it's humanly possible. Um, Zone 4 intensity means it's above the second threshold, above the anaerobic or lactate or maximum lactate state, whatever you want to call it. That intensity is only going to be sustainable for several minutes at a time. This is the reason that high intensity training, I mean, sometimes people do interval training in zone 3, but when you get to zone 4, or if you have a five zone system, when you get up into zone 5, you will be forced to do your high intensity training in an interval fashion, meaning a typical zone 4 workout might be 5 times 4 minutes with a 4-minute rest in between each one. So that's because you can't sustain 20 minutes at zone 4 intensity. It just doesn't happen. So if you think you're doing that, then you should probably reevaluate your zones, whether it's doing blood lactate testing or gas analysis or something like that. So now going back to the fueling question, I think it certainly wouldn't hurt you to take some gels, or to have some sugar before you start this, although I don't think it's that important. Because the aerobic threshold is very close to what we would call the 50-50, the crossover point in metabolism. It's a point where you're shifting from mainly fats to predominantly carbohydrates. So somewhere close to the aerobic threshold, you'll be using about 50% carbs and 50% fat. So in this, you shouldn't be just blasting through your carbohydrate stores if you're actually in zone 2. That you should be predominantly using fat. So it shouldn't be necessary to fuel during an aerobic threshold test, unless you are, I mean, let's see, what would be the reason for that?
Diabetic. Right.
I
That's a
suppose
whole
if you
different
were,
thing.
yeah, I don't know that a diabetic would have that problem, but I think that, people who are used to eating a lot of sugar, or,
Mm,
even like there are people who have to go for an hour run and they've got to take 2 or 3 goos with them. And so
mm,
they've kind of conditioned their body to run more on glycogen. That person might struggle with this. But if they do, that's an even better reason for them to be training in zone 2, because they probably should be getting better at fat adaptation. So when I talked about, I just mentioned that, and it's not strictly true that the aerobic threshold is at exactly the 50-50 fat versus carbs point, but it happens close to that. Sometimes the crossover will be a little below aerobic threshold, and sometimes it's a bit above, but it's in that range. So that's why I say I don't think you're going to be burning through that many grams of carbohydrate in the aerobic threshold test.
mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that that's a great answer. And yeah, you comprehensively answered that. I would make sure you are properly fueled before. I think there's more harm in going in under fueled, like you've skipped lunch or something, than fueling. So, mhm.
Yeah.
The next question we have here is this person says, my mountain activities are fast packing and ski touring. My base miles are done on hilly trails. I don't have ADS, aerobic deficiency syndrome, thanks to great Evoke guidance. I have a situation that many listeners may relate to. My running partner, sometimes my spouse or my pet, have a hard time keeping up with my pace, so I slow down. This puts me near the top of my recovery zone, but not into zone 1, and certainly not zone 2. I don't do all my training with my partner, but I do a significant amount with them. What can I do to ensure I'm getting enough training stress to improve my aerobic system? Should I extend the time of my training runs at this lower pace or add some weight in a pack to increase the intensity? Thanks in advance for your guidance.
Well, if you don't have ADS, then doing a higher volume of easier training is certainly not going to hurt you. And it should leave you fresher for doing either zone 2 or zone 3 work at some point during the week, maybe the times you run by yourself. Perhaps when you're out with your spouse, you could run at their pace for an hour, and then you drop them back off at home or the car and say, I'll be back in 20 minutes. And you do kind of a steady state tempo run in high zone 2 or low zone 3 to get some of that training benefit. And that could be very helpful because during that early stage of the run, you will have been depleting glycogen a little bit, muscle glycogen. And as a consequence, when you try to pick up the pace, that's going to, you're going to struggle a little bit with that glycogen depletion. And as people who have heard me talk about this before would remember, that glycogen depletion is probably the single biggest stimulus to aerobic development. And that's what caused, because that's what signals this AMPK signaling pathway. And AMP meaning adenosine monophosphate, and K standing for kinase, which means it's an enzyme. So we produce this AMPK enzyme, and that starts a signaling pathway that trickles all the way down to the genetic level and turns these genes on that are responsible for many of the aerobic adaptations. And so, and that's the reason for doing all this high volume of low intensity training, is we're trying to produce more mitochondria, better capillarization in those working muscles. And that's exactly what happens when you stimulate this AMPK signaling pathway. So if it's just a little bit like doing a fasted workout. That jump starts the AMPK signaling pathway. So in your case, let's say you do an hour run at the top of your recovery zone, And even though it's easy for you, you're still going to be burning carbohydrates. And so there'll be a little bit of muscle glycogen depletion. And then if you go try to do a sustained tempo run for 20 or 30 minutes, you're going to be doing that in a slightly glycogen depleted state, meaning that AMPK signaling pathway is going to be getting a bit of a boost. So I think it could be, quite beneficial to think about doing one or a couple of those in a week. I think would be really good for you.
Yeah, Scott, this question popped into my mind along the lines of this. So let's say this guy, you know, he's saying he beat ADS, so it seems like it was a thing for him. And it takes like 4 to 6 weeks for us to see often on average, a little bit of a shift in that heart rate, the top of zone 2. So let's say he did beat ADS, and then for 4 to 6 to 8 weeks, he does zone 1 training. Would he see a decline in his zone 2? Like, do you have to do a certain amount to maintain? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think you do need a little bit of stimulus there. If you could, looking at the extreme case, if you just went to, sitting on the couch, you'd obviously see a decline in your aerobic threshold. So if you don't give your body the stimulus that it needs, so if you're just doing exclusively a recovery zone training, you're probably going to see a bit of a decline. But I don't think it doesn't take much, as you know this very well from yourself. Once you develop a fitness trait, it doesn't take that much to sustain it or maintain it. So once you've gotten your aerobic threshold pretty high, like this person has, then 1 or 2 workouts a week in that high zone 2, low zone 3 range for this person would be really beneficial, and they'll sustain and may even improve.
Okay. No, that's good information. So our next question here is from Johnny, and he says, "Hi, greetings from Norway. I'm really enjoying the podcasts and articles. Any insight or tips on how to change gears from ultra running into Nordic skiing as the season is coming up? Looking to race the Birkebeiner
Rennet, yes.
okay, in March
Yeah.
2025. It's a super classic race here in Norway, 57 kilometers long. Required to carry a pack that weighs 3.5 kilos through the whole race. One area I'm going to focus on is ski technique, economy, and efficiency. While being Norwegian and quote unquote born with skis on my feet, I know this is an area of improvement for me. All the best." And you'd have a good answer for this since you have an extensive Nordic background, Scott.
Yeah, and that's a great race. So, and it is it's like a rite of passage for Norwegians to do that race. I mean, there'll be, 12,000 people in that race.
Cool.
It goes over a little mountain range in kind of almost a little north of the center of Norway. But anyway, yes, technique is going to be, like I mentioned earlier in this podcast, swimming being a very technical sport. Well, cross-country skiing is even more technically demanding than swimming because you've got the balance component. You're trying to balance on a 2-inch wide ski that's sliding along the ground, at 15 miles an hour. It's pretty tricky. So classic technique is really, and it's tricky to learn. It's hard to learn classic technique. Now, hopefully you, being Norwegian, you spent your youth learning to ski. But yes, that will be an important factor. And I would work a lot on developing upper body muscular endurance. Because if you've been running, your legs are quite fit now, but there's also a good chance you haven't been doing anything with your upper body. So that could be done in a gym, doing, high repetition, like pull downs on a lat pull down machine, standing in front of the pull down machine with, holding the bar out in front of you like you were double polling. Another way I've done that a lot is just double polling on roller skis. And so that would be something, and you can even do single polling muscular endurance workouts on a slight incline where you're just doing the single pole motion like in a diagonal stride, but up a slight hill. And these could be repetitions anywhere from 2 to 3 or 4 minutes, and then roll back down to the bottom of the hill and repeat. But the fact that you haven't probably been doing much with your upper body, that would be where, between technique and shifting the emphasis to upper body stuff is what I would recommend.
Yeah, or ski erg, I think is I
Yep,
coached
ski ergs.
a
Yep.
Norwegian and I said, "Oh, do you have a ski erg in your gym?" And he laughed at me and said, "We have a ski erg in every gym." I was like,
Yes.
"Okay,
Yeah. Well, and they
right,
have
your
different
national
kinds.
sport."
Right. We have one brand in this country made
Yeah,
by Concept 2, the rowing company.
it's rare.
Um,
It
but
often
in
too.
Europe, there must be at least 8 or 10 companies that make similar uh, upper body skier type training
Hmm.
devices. Although I have to say, having used a bunch of them, um, the Concept 2 skier is the best one for sure.
Hmm. I'm gonna
It'll,
just
oh, go ahead.
um,
Sorry.
skip to the question 16 here, Scott, because I
Hmm.
think it's more in line with this last one.
Yeah.
So this person, Pedro is his name, says, after a taper come race day, sometimes my legs feel, for lack of a better word, lazy, even if I do an easy run the day before the event. I've heard some athletes like Johannes Klebo, uh, who's a cross country skier, and Stein Angermund, a trail runner, actually do intervals the day before a race. If I understood correctly, these were not just like simple strides, but an actual interval session. If done correctly, is this something that is likely to help prevent the lazy legs feeling the next day, specifically for shorter events like uphill trail races, VKs? If so, how should one go about performing this race prep workout?
Yes, you're right. You should be doing something like that. There's a reason those guys do that when they're tapering, or even if, like, for someone like Klebo, who is racing, probably 40, 45 times in a season, he can't taper for every race. He might back off a day or so. But doing something the day before you race that has some speed and power to it, I think is a really good way to wake your legs up. I often will have people take 2 days before the race and take it either off or very light. And then the day before the race, they're going to do some sort of intensity. And it won't be an exhausting workout by any means. But if you're well trained, it would be a version of something you've been doing. So let's say, the week before you had done, 5 by 4 minutes or something like that in terms, at a fairly high intensity. Well, then this day before the race, it might be something like 3 by 2 minutes, just enough to, get the juices flowing again, wake your muscles up. Because a lot of people have this problem when they taper too much,
Mm-hmm.
they get sort of a stale, heavy leg feeling.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's quite common. It's a great question.
Yes, God, I superstitiously prescribe to this too. I don't know if there's science, as much science behind it, but agree for before races, doing a bit of, and even in my warm up, a bit of intensity. And I thought, in light of now being coaching and what I've been learning from you, I like to feel the lactic shuttle kick in a sense. I don't know if that makes any
Mhm.
sense scientifically, but mentally it feels like that's what I'm stimulating by doing something more than a stride. So something more than like 10 seconds of
Yeah.
effort. It seems to tap into that either mental place or even physiologically. Do you know what is happening? Why, like on
I
a
th- I
going into the
think I
weeds
do.
level?
Yeah, I think I do. And here's so typically what I've done, and I think is quite common, most people, when they start tapering, they drop the volume,
Mhm.
but they will pepper the workouts with a little more intensity. And I think the reason that helps people and makes them feel better is that the anaerobic side of the metabolic stimulus we're looking for, those adaptations are primarily enzymatic. In other words, they're mainly um, enzymes like lactose dehydrogenase, which basically are breaking down sugars they're faster. I mean, that's what, when you increase your anaerobic capacity, you're increasing your ability to break down glycogen or glucose more rapidly. And because they are enzymatic adaptations, they come on really fast, but they go away really quickly. If you don't keep them
Mm-hmm.
stimulated, they go
Mm-hmm.
away. And then you won't have that feeling of power so that's why I think it's beneficial to keep just a little bit of that high intensity work sprinkled throughout a taper period so that you don't get this feeling of like, what has happened to my legs? I feel like they've got lead in them now, because you don't, then you're going to lose that, that. Remember that even though the aerobic metabolism dominates the energy production, the anaerobic side of the metabolism provides a critical and vital component to producing energy. We need to keep that, fired up, especially for people who are racing a lot. So just abandoning that and doing nothing but cutting volume and keeping the intensity low is almost always going to, I think, make you feel flat and heavy.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. Theoretically and practically from what I've experienced as well. So the next question we have is shifting gears back to mountaineering. This person says, I puke at altitude no matter how soon or how far in advance I arrive for a race. Any suggestions? I guess aside from just saying you are bad at altitude altogether.
It could be. That could be. You may have drawn the short straw in the altitude genetics. There are people that don't adapt well.
No.
So, I mean, when you say you puke, or there's reasons people puke in races, that it could be from going too hard. I mean, if you don't puke by just going to altitude and doing low intensity, like walking around or doing an easy run or hike or something, doesn't cause you to throw up, then I would say it more likely has something to do with the intensity that you're using in the race. So you might want to evaluate that. I mean, you do become more acidic at high altitude. Your body becomes more acidic. It upsets your pH balance. But that usually, you say it doesn't matter how far in advance you arrive. I mean, I don't know what you mean by that. I mean, if you went there a month before, you would still have this problem, because most people aren't going to arrive at the race site a month before. But if you're arriving 4 or 5 days before, that could be part of the problem. My experience has been that day 3 and 4 after going to altitude are often the worst days. So you either want to, I mean, I've had this experience myself and with others I've coached, is you either want to show up like the morning of the race and just get off the airplane, step up to the starting line and go, and hope your body hasn't really figured out what's happening to it. And you're going to be suffering a great deal, but you can often, especially if it's a short thing, you can sometimes fake it a little bit, or you need to show up 3 weeks in advance. It's like showing up the week of, I think, is often kind of dangerous for people, and especially showing up 3 or 4 days before. That's, in my experience, been like the kiss of death. It's same with jet lag. You've had this experience with jet lag.
Yeah.
3 days into a trip, that's not the day you want to be racing. Yeah.
Yeah, all I can do is commiserate with you. I've definitely shown up to a race and I puked all over an Italian mountain guide racing from Valley Bottom to the top of Mount Castor as fast as possible. And I think what I've deduced is that as much as I don't like it, I have to dial back the intensity. If you're really good at pushing yourself, you will push yourself to puke. So you might have to be disciplined to just control the effort when you get above a certain amount of meters. And unfortunately, if you're not great at altitude, that could be like 2,600 even, who knows, but you could practice with figuring out where you start to feel that. Yeah.
Altitude is a lot about experience. You got to figure stuff out. There's no guide, there's no handbook on exactly how to do it.
For sure. The last question, we've come to our last question here. And Jamie says, as a newcomer to ultras, it'd be nice to know how to pace a race. Is it based on staying within your zone 2 heart rate? How does ascending and descending affect this plan? How do you tell whether you're overcooking the hills? Before the race, how do you break a course profile down and determine the technical parts? How do you estimate your checkpoints and overall finish time? Are there any race dynamics at the front pack when you may have to abandon the race plan. Hopefully, some points of discussion on the pod. So many questions there. We
Many
may
questions. Yeah.
many
Um, well,
and good
I'm
ones.
actually, they are good. His whole pacing thing in ultras is a very interesting topic. I'm going to be doing a podcast with Ruth Croft, who I coach, who was second at the UTMB this year and used a, let's say, not, well, quite novel for her pacing strategy. And I think pretty novel for the women that were in that race. She was one of the only ones that didn't slow down at the end. In fact, she was gaining a lot of time on the leaders and
Mhm.
passed all of them but one. In the last part of the race, coming back into Chamonix, the long downhill from the top of the Le Flégère lift into town, she was 4 minutes faster than the fastest man in the race.
Mhm.
And on the climb up to the top of the Flégère, she was 13 minutes faster than the winning woman, Katie Scheid.
Mhm.
And so what it tells us is that she had plenty of gas left in the tank, that she could still produce a lot of energy, a lot of power on the uphills and then the downhill as well. And this is something we just published an article that I would encourage people to go read, that talks a little bit about this thing um, in ultra running, the need for building fatigue resistance into your muscles. The reason people get slower in ultra running races is not that they're lacking aerobic power, or VO2 max is down, because late in these races or even early in the races, you're only using a fairly small fraction of your absolute aerobic power, or VO2 max. Estimating from what the athletes I work with, even elites are probably only using 75% of their absolute maximum aerobic power in the whole race. So, and what happens, if you can only access 65% when you're fresh, well, toward the end of the race, because your legs are tired, you may only be accessing 40% of your VO2 max. And that's what was happening to the women that I saw in that race, who were slowing down dramatically toward the end, is they had gotten so tired that their heart's ability to provide oxygen was not what was slowing them down. What was slowing them down was the ability of their legs to keep moving and keep utilizing that oxygen. So
Mhm.
building fatigue resistance is the best thing you can do to improve your results in ultra running. Now, as far as developing a pacing plan, I think that the big problem with ultra running is that the intensity of the event is, if it should be anyway, especially at the start, it needs to be relatively easy. It's so much slower than your absolute most fastest speed that you're having to really restrain yourself.
Mhm.
And the problem that leads to is that early in the race, people are excited and everyone's fresh. So the pace tends to be too fast for everyone.
Mhm.
And then somewhere during the race, people are going to start dropping off of it, and some of them will hang on till late in the race, or other people will get shed off early in the race because the pace, even though it felt easy, was too fast. I mean, if you choose the wrong pace in a 5 kilometer race, you're going to know it within seconds. You're
Mhm.
going to go, oh boy, I better slow down. Whereas in a ultra running race, and the reason is that in a 5K race, you're so close to your absolute endurance limit during that race that it gives you instant feedback. But in an ultra running race, you're so far away from your endurance limit in terms of the intensity that you feel like, well, I could easily run faster than this. Well, yes, of course you could now. And so making a pacing error early in a race by maybe only a few seconds per kilometer could cost you many minutes per kilometer later in the race when you're having to walk and everyone else is running. So
Mhm.
you need to go a lot easier than you think. Now, how easy is easy? Well, if these pros can't figure it out, I'm not going to be able to tell you on a podcast how to do that other than practice,
Mhm.
but it's a lot easier. Ruth's instructions before the start of that race were you need to go slow. You need to go very slow. I mean, you need to go very, very slow for the first half of the race. And she did. She came through the first checkpoint, I think, or maybe it was even farther along, Contamine, like, 30K into it. She was 118th place.
Hmm.
And in overall, 118th. She finished the race 16th place overall, men and women.
Hmm.
So she passed 112 people in that, basically the last 2/3 of the race. So you can do a lot of damage late in the race if you're fresh when everybody else is tired. Anybody who's ever been passed when they're almost exhausted knows what a demoralizing feeling that is. And if you can be the one that's doing the passing, then you're putting the hurt on your competitors there. So I would say you got to practice this. So how do you tell if you're overcooking it on the hills? Definitely go read that article. I show you in there how much time these athletes spend in the higher intensity zones in both their training and their racing. I have profiles of some of the elite athletes I work with, and I give you their overall training volume and then what their races look like. And you'll see they don't race very hard. They're very rarely even into zone 3. Maybe in a 100-kilometer race, they might spend, a few minutes in zone 3. The rest of the time is in zone 1 and 2. How do you break down the course profile and determine the technical parts? Well, that comes with experience. So you have to know the course. And this is a bit of a, this is, I don't think I can answer these in one podcast. These are the kind of things that, I have to be working with an athlete for years in order we can get down into this level of detail. In estimating your overall finish time, the only way I could say you could do that is, have you run this race before? And do you have previous times on the course? But I don't think, because these courses are all so different from race to race. I don't think you can say, well, just because I ran this speed in this race, the next race is going to be completely different.
Yeah, I think it takes practice and confidence and self-control. Like, I just coached a gal who finished Tour de Glaciers, which is 450 kilometers. She came fourth. And again, like you said to Ruth, like, go slow, go very slow. My advice to her was around sleeping. I said, if you need to sleep, sleep and sleep long. And it feels so stressful because people are getting ahead of you while you're sleeping. But looking at times of people who don't and they degenerate into barely moving, that is extremely slow versus actually getting some deep rest and on average moving quicker. So I think that, like, Ruth's performance I think it's pretty ground shifting a little bit. I don't want to, in terms of maybe thinking about pacing these races too. So maybe there'll be some analysis into that. But it comes down to confidence, though, and knowing yourself, because I don't know Ruth, but I'm a racer, and it feels stressful when everyone's getting ahead of you, no matter where you are in a race. So kudos to her mental game too as an athlete. That's a huge part of it.
Yeah, she had a lot of confidence in her fitness and in the race plan, and she stuck to her guns. But like I said, we'll be doing a podcast with her as soon as we can get our schedules to align. It'll talk more about that. The last question that Jamie asked is about, the tactics at the race dynamics up at the front of the pack. UTMB this year, there was a lot of that happening. And I don't know how many people followed that race, but that's kind of the penultimate mountain running race in the world. None of the top 10 guys even finished that race.
Wow.
They all had to abandon.
They ran each other into the ground, literally.
Basically, for one reason or another, there was, a lot of, it was hot and humid this year. The men are running so fast that the heat accumulation for them, I think, is more, and men don't handle the heat as well as women do. I think women have a real advantage in these ultra running races. I think women are better at ultra long endurance.
Hmm.
The only reason that very few women can be up in the front with the men is only that the men are bigger and stronger, so they can
Yeah.
run faster. But I think the
Physiology.
women actually have better endurance
Mm-hmm.
than the men do.
Yeah.
But anyway, none of these top guys finished, and it was quite a shakeup this year. And I know that it had to do with tactics at the front of the race. You
Hmm.
know, if they see somebody who's one of their competitors going off the front, well, they're going to try to go with them.
Yeah.
And yeah, even though the pace wasn't, particularly any faster than previous years, I can't explain it all, but I do know there's something we should all take that as a lesson. I've never seen that happen at the UTMB where
Mm-hmm.
none, I mean, because they hand out the bibs, the starting numbers based on your kind of your overall ranking.
Yeah.
None of the bibs, the starting numbers from 1 through 10 finished the race.
Wow.
So
That's crazy.
yeah, it says
Yeah.
something was going on up there at the front of the
Yeah.
race.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah.
I think if Tom Evans had used more like Ruth's plan, he could
Mm-hmm.
have he had the fitness to win that race for sure.
Sure. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, there's a
Yeah.
lot to be figured out there.
Yeah, it's fascinating. As you know, I'm a huge sports fan and I follow sports just because I enjoy it. But yeah, even an older race like the Tour de France, you see those cat and mouse dynamics playing out nonstop every day. And I think it's a natural progression in ultra running too. That's part of it is this head game, the strategy, and it's part of being a professional. And it's neat to as an armchair observer, it's
Yeah.
interesting to watch for sure.
And I
Yeah.
think that the tactics and strategy are becoming more and more important. The
Yeah.
finishing times are getting so much closer. The top people are, you're not seeing 30-minute spreads between first and second anymore, like you used
No.
to 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah,
So yeah, it's getting more competitive. And
for sure. Good. Well, thanks.
well,
Thanks for chatting today, Scott.
yeah, thank you, Kylie. Thanks for
Hmm.
getting us organized with all this stuff. And thanks
No
everyone
problem.
for listening in and joining us today. I know we went a bit long, but it's great to have you all along for our conversations. And I hope people are getting something out of this.
Yeah, and
Look
send
forward to
us
seeing.
your
Go ahead.
questions via DM or coach@evokeendurance.com for October.
Yep.
And we prefer just a little more generalized questions. If you have a specific one, we'll probably direct you to getting coaching support. But keep the good questions coming.
Yeah. Well, thanks, folks, and we'll see everybody next month.